King David IV had just gone on an incredible streak of military victories and turned the Kingdom of Georgia into a proper empire. But then he died before he could savor the fruits of his long campaign. But he had left Georgia better than he had found it in every single way, including his succession. After 4 separate regencies and 4 adolescent monarchs, the Kingdom of Georgia would finally be inherited by an adult. On the surface, the 32-year-old Demetrius seemed as good a man as any to keep the newly formed empire together. But with one of the greatest military minds of the Middle Ages dead, what happens now? Dimitri, or Demetrius Bagrationi, was born in the 11th year of David IV's reign, 1093 AD. His mother was an Armenian by the name of Rusudan, and little else is known about her beyond this and her children. Demetrius was the eldest of 3 sisters, whose names in order of birth are Princess Tamar, Kata, and like her mother, Rusudan. This Bagrationi royal family would have been a very well-educated one, blessed with having the learned David IV as a father. I'm sure his building of many schools in Georgia was synonymous with his children's own education. Unfortunately, and early in the young Dimitri's life, political opportunity would push David IV to divorce Queen Rusudan in favor of the daughter of a Turkic nomadic warlord from the far north, who would be baptized and renamed Grand Duke. It's unrecorded, of course, how Dimitri felt about any of this, but 10 years later, the 24-year-old crown prince who had likely been exposed to the Georgian Seljuk War already was given his first big military role. Dimitri was to lead a campaign on Georgia's eastern neighbor in the Caucasus, Shirvan, and Sakartvelo's future king did not disappoint. He took a hard-fought-over border fortress and then raided deep into the country. While he was ahead of himself, he turned the Georgian army around and returned to his father, having brought back a measurable amount of wealth along with a new stronghold. Demetrius now took his role as a full-blown general in the army. It's likely around this time where we get our only physical description of Dimitri Bagrationi. David IV, citing how good of hand Georgia will be left in, names off some of the crown prince's most redeeming qualities. He calls on his son for his wisdom, his chastity, his bravery, and to top it all off, he was apparently very handsome. A real Prince Charming type. The year following the Shirvan campaign, Dimitri's Cuman stepmother would give birth to her only child. An infant boy named Vakhtang now threatened the succession. While his claim was pushed to the side at the moment for his age, he was the firstborn son of a second wife, a wife who was not divorced. This didn't go well before with Bagrat IV's younger half-brother, and really the claim is fair enough, but Vakhtang would not reach adulthood before the death of the rebuilder. In 1121, Demetrius would prove himself on the fields of Georgia's most storied victory, the Battle of Didgori. The prince hid in the deep thicket of the ridge overlooking the main battle, patiently waiting for his father to give the signal. Anticipation grew, finally leading the charge that broke the massive enemy army. He nearly encircled his foe. It's safe to say Didgori was a massacre, and while it is owed to David IV, Dimitri's charge was surely the hammer to his anvil. After defeating the Seljuks and in the midst of carving out an empire, David IV became ill and rushed back to Tbilisi. Here he anointed Demetrius as king, giving him the noble regalia and armor before dying in January of 1125. But apparently King David didn't give up the crown of Georgia, deciding to let it go with him to the grave. Not literally, of course, but it begs the question, why didn't David IV crown his firstborn son as king if he knew he was going to die? Could be a personal attachment thing, which I would understand, but many scholars have debated this fact and complemented it with an alternative will of David IV Bagrationi. This likely theoretical will gives Demetrius Georgia and leaves him an option for his own succession. If he ever became a capable enough prince, David IV suggested making the now 7-year-old Vakhtang king. I honestly don't see David IV making this mistake, but even if it wasn't real, it was something that would itself be suggested in the not-so-far-away future. While David left Georgia an empire, he also left it slightly overexpanded, especially in the south towards Armenia. The Seljuks were practically masters of being defeated and then just coming back with a new army to plunder some more, so it would only be a matter of time before they licked their wounds clean of Didgori Valley. Although expansive, David IV left the empire one clear goal on where to expand to next. Of course, the practically encircled Ganja, and its protected trade road going south towards Iran. But before Dmitri could usher in his reign with the city that had held off David on 2 separate occasions, the Seljuks struck the seemingly competent new king. There was no way he was a military mind parallel to his father. That was 1 in a million. And they would prove to be right. But he had learned a thing or two from him. The Seljuks attacked the far southeast of Georgia, the undersupplied front in Dmanisi, which had only just fallen back into Bagration domains. Demetrius rushed there in all earnest and arrived just in time. In his first military action as king, the Seljuks were chased off. For now. But as always, they would be back. He had passed his first test as king with flying colors. But not even a year later, a far more internal and personal threat presented itself in the form of Shirvan. In 1126, Dimitri's brother-in-law, through his sister Tamar, Shirvan Shah Manachur III, with Seljuk support, revolted against Georgia. He freed what he was left to rule and retook the western half of Shirvan that David IV had formally incorporated into the Bagrationi crown lands. Demetrius did not pounce on this problem and attack Shirvan as he had in his youth, but this is only because another threat made a long return from his exile. Fadil Shadadid, the son of the emir who King David had ousted from his seat in Ani, returned from the east after the latter's death. Surprisingly, the governor of Ani and general of the southern front, Abuleti, allowed Fadil to enter the city unharmed. He was presented to Ani's Council of Elders, where it was agreed that Ani's Christian liberation would be reversed and Fadil would become emir, taking the city without a fight, just as David IV had. This begs the question, why? Why give up Ani to an exiled Kurd who held no real power? Rumors of treason found their way to King Dmitri, but as Abuleti and his son Ivan returned from their sale of Ani, the king gave them the benefit of the doubt as they returned to their ancestral castles in southern Georgia. Perhaps Fadil had threatened them with his alliance to the Seljuks and his cousins in Aran, and Abuleti was just protecting the city's populace. Or maybe it's as simple as a lucrative bribe. Either way, Ani and most of northern Armenia was back under the sway of his enemies. With Shirvan and now Ani lost, Dmitri surprisingly sat patiently for 3 peaceful years. Finally, in 1129, at least one of these parties would come to the negotiation table. Shirvan Shah Manachur III, the brother-in-law of King Dmitri, was ready to rejoin the Georgian realm. After all, there was far more benefits for himself and his own people to be part of Georgia's protection racket and economy. Likely thanks to his own sister, Tamar, the status quo returned. Western and predominantly Christian Shirvan would become part of Georgia proper, while the rest would remain a vassal supplying Dmitri tax and soldiers in times of crisis. To further secure his eastern flank, Dmitri took a step to keep the Shirvanites in check by marrying one of his 3 daughters to the Emir of Derbent, who just so happened to be Shirvan's arch-nemesis. The Avars of Dagestan, despite being Muslims, appeared to be one of the most loyal vassal states in the Georgian Empire, perhaps only matched by Alania. With Shirvan dealt with, there still remained the Ani question, but before any negotiations could be finalized, King Dmitri got an answer. Shah Armenia made another swing at Georgia, this time in league with Emir Fadil of Ani. Before Dmitri could react, the Turkish ruler of southern Armenia, Shah Armen Sakmen II, restarted the battle for northern Armenia, a campaign that would last the better part of 3 decades, fluctuating in intensity as the years went on. He found some initial successes, but never managed to gain a serious foothold in the southern reaches of the Georgian Empire. The same cannot be said for his partner in crime, however, Emir Fadolivani. The Emir marched south, taking advantage of his position in the overstretched empire. He captured the ancient city of Divin before turning to his cousins entrapped in Ganja. He took the city, thereby ending the near-complete Georgian blockade. But just as Emir Fadel had returned the Shaddadid dynasty to its former glory, he was murdered in a palace coup likely orchestrated by his brother. And then another brother murdered him. And then the final brother was murdered. Then the final brother's son, Fakir, became the new Emir of Ani, Divin, and Ganja. Finally, after a year of 4 emirs, the fourth was far more willing to subscribe himself to peace talks with King Dmitri. Fakir would keep the lands that his uncle had conquered. All he had to do was keep the Cathedral of Ani as a Christian site and pay a small tax. But if this former was disturbed for whatever reason, King Dmitri would have the right to protect the Christians of the city with an army. This treaty was somewhat embarrassing for the Georgians, but King Dmitri didn't see it that way. If there is one main contrast between Dmitri and his father, then it is that King Demetrius preferred peace above all else. He had seen firsthand what 20 years of relentless warfare had done to the Georgians and their most celebrated king. Thousands of widows and orphans could tell you this firsthand. And while it appeared a lost war, Demetrius was more determined to protect the welfare of his people, and if that meant giving back some land that would already be challenging to hold, then so be it. With the war over, it was time to deal with the nobles who were responsible, Abuleti and his son Ivan. But one of them was already a step ahead of the king. Ivan was plotting against King Dmitri, as he led a coalition of nobles who wished to place the now 13-year-old Prince Vakhtang on the throne. The Mistovarni spy network set up by David IV had caught the plot just in time, however. Abuleti, Ivan, and Vakhtang were all imprisoned and put on trial. Abuleti was found innocent, having no knowledge of his son's treason, and disowning him when he had found out. Ivan would surprisingly be appointed a general and shipped off to the southernmost front in Tau Klarjeti. But shortly after arriving, the Mistovarni would sneak into his bedroom and behead him. The job was done so well that no one even knew until they found a headless Ivan the next day. As for his much younger half-brother, Vakhtang, he too was found guilty. It's unknown how much the child prince was actually involved in the failed coup, but his punishment was likely one of necessity over involvement. Vakhtang, the poor boy, would be blinded, his eyes gouged out, ensuring that he would never become a king. The youngest child of David IV lived for 7 more years, but would die of an eye, or, an eye socket infection at the age of 20. While Dmitri was a fan of peace, he wasn't afraid to show his nobles what happened to the unloyal. With the always active Georgian nobility quelled for a time, Demetrius went back to his peace. Of course, with the exception of the Shah-Armenia War, but as stated previously, this was practically a stalemate. For 5 years, the Kingdom of Georgia enjoyed a peace it hadn't seen since the days of Bagrat IV nearly 75 years ago. A much-needed recovery as Demetrius fixed his attention to running a smooth government, which he appeared to successfully head. In 1136, the long peace was finally broken. A new player appeared in the tumultuous world of the medieval Caucasus, what many would come to call the first incarnation of Azerbaijan was born from the dying Seljuk Empire. The Seljuk Sultan gave nearly all his remaining possessions in the Caucasus to none other than a Kipchak general by the name of Eldaguz, hoping he could do something about the Georgian threat. While the Seljuks hoped this would solve the Georgian problem, all they really did was create their own puppet master that would eventually lead to the death of the Seljuk Empire a few decades later. But for now, the Seljuk realm was nearly unified under this Caucasian emir. Eldaguz bursted from the south. Kipchaks and Seljuks now fought together and cut a path through eastern Georgia, vassalizing Shirvan and Aran in a flurry before taking all the lands in between. Demetrius tried in vain to defend these eastern territories, but the only thing that saved him was the very same thing that had led to his own father's rise to power. As tectonic plates shifted, the earth gave in to tremble. An earthquake ripped through the land Eldaguz had just conquered, as if it was a prophetic sign from God himself. The city of Ganja would be the epicenter. In a few moments, the thorn in the side of the Georgian Empire was reduced to rubble, as a reported 20,000 were left dead. Finally, with this opportunity, King Demetrius sprung to action and gathered an army to finish what the earth had started for him. He swiftly marched on Ganja and easily took the city, something his father had failed to do on 2 separate occasions. In a display of power, he took the coveted city gates off their hinges and hauled them back to Gelati Monastery, not before engraving his own victory on the cast iron gates. I, King Dimitri, have smashed Caucasian Albania and taken these gates forever. In the following years, Eldaguz would try to reclaim the rebelled city, but the Georgians were simply too quick and refortified the gateless Ganja before the emir arrived. Seeing that the seizure of Ganja would not be a foregone conclusion, Eldaguz decided to pick on the Georgian territory damaged by the peripheries of the earthquake. He took the province of Artsakh with relative ease in 1142, but in the following year Dimitri decided to make his peace with these new and far more ferocious subjugators. He gave Ganja as a dowry, as his only named daughter Rusudan was married off to the Seljuk Sultan, who is technically the overlord of Eldaguz. No member of the Georgian royal family had married a Seljuk Sultan since the days of Alp Arslan. By going over the head of the Azerbaijani Atabeg, meant peace was brought with only one daughter and one gateless Ganja. He had nearly lost a third of his empire. But once again, these were far away and difficult to defend lands. An even longer and more tranquil peace would follow for the next decade. As the Georgians and their new Azeri neighbors rebuilt their cities and religious buildings, they had to have known that this peace could not last past the life of Dimitri. Sometime in the 1140s, there was a fallout between King Dimitri and his eldest son, David. The reason remains a mystery, but it got so bad that Dimitri disinherited the prince in favor of his younger and more level-headed son, George. In 1150, deep in the long peace, an attempted palace coup was discovered that would place David on the throne. But just as the previous coup headed by Ivan and Vakhtang was discovered, the Mistovarni spies were always one step ahead of the game. Despite their falling out, Dimitri still had a soft spot for his firstborn, and spared him from a discreet beheading or an infectious eye gouging. He remained at the court, something Dimitri would soon come to regret. In 1152, the Seljuk Sultan that Princess Rusudan had married would die. She would thereafter be shipped off to that same man's great uncle, the last Seljuk who held any real power still, the near 70-year-old Ahmad Sanjar in the east. In the following year, the Emir of Ani, Fakir Shadadid, who had been strangely quiet up until this point, made a double backstabbing move to remove his Islamic rivals. He invited the nearby Emir of Erzurum to Ani, so he could sell the city to him. Emir Saltuk II marched on Ani with a somewhat small army, not expecting any sort of fight. Dimitri was already fighting the Shah Armenians nearby when he got the news from Emir Fakir himself, instructing the king to ambush their mutual enemy for the benefit of them both. Dimitri found his spot waiting along the Silk Road trade route that went through Ani. and just as planned, the ambush was a success. The enemy were surrounded and surrendered almost immediately. The soldiers were sold into slavery, and they even took Emir Saltuk back to Tbilisi as a hostage, posting him up for ransom. King Demetrius left it to his nobles to decide the price for the emir's release. Rather surprisingly, they chose the price of 100,000 dinars. A hefty sum for a peasant, but for a nation such as Georgia, this was kinda junk change. It will soon become clear just why these nobles were seemingly giving away their payday. They were trying to slander Dmitri, making him appear weak. But the rule of the king continued as his final child and last unnamed daughter came of age to be married off. While his other daughters had married two nearby Muslim rulers, Demetrius wished to strengthen his ties with his Orthodox brethren. Not in the Byzantine East, but for the first time, Georgia would expand its politics far to the north. In the lands of the Kievan Rus, the daughter would marry the Grand Prince of Kiev, Iziaslav II. This marriage alliance could have been just the thing Georgia needed to reclaim its easternmost provinces. But it would all be for naught. The 58-year-old Grand Prince would die a few months after his second marriage. The Bagrationi princess would return to Tbilisi, never marrying again. While this was Russia's first attempted alliance with Georgia that would end in shambles, it certainly would not be the last. In 1155, after 30 years of reign, King Demetrius Bagrationi would be overthrown in a palace coup led by none other than his disgraced son, David. He would exile his father to become a monk, change his name to Damian, and send him off to faraway David Goreji Monastery, located on the modern-day borders of Georgia and Azerbaijan. This incredible church complex was built in the 6th century by an Assyrian monk. Its modern position in both Azerbaijan and Georgia splits this incredible one-of-a-kind structure built into a cliff face. Now, I know the Georgians and Azeri don't necessarily get along that well, but someone please figure this out. I don't even care who owns it at this point. Make it a complete neutral zone. It's just too cool to be in the middle of a potentially unstable borderland. Anyways, here the former King Demetrius, now monk Damian, would spend his days praying. Without the intensities of kingship, Demetrius now had the time to fulfill one of his passions, inherited from his father, composing hymns and music. But the former king would not fiddle for long before he was called back to Tbilisi. The newly crowned King David V managed to piss off the same nobles who had just helped him overthrow his father. He had promised the role of marshal to one of the Orbeli brothers, Sumbat and Ivan II. Instead, he invited the son of the beheaded Ivan Abuleti out of exile so that he may become the new head of the Georgian military. Within 6 months of his reign, having accomplished nothing, King David V was poisoned by the Orbeli brothers, and Dmitri was invited back from his monastery to take up the kingship yet again. The succession and all legal rights should have passed to David V's still unborn son, Denma, but this was passed up for a return of his grandfather. When Dmitri arrived, he made it clear that he wasn't going to stay for long. He came to Tbilisi still in the robes of a monk, appointed his now only son as co-king George III, and then he just left, returning to David Goreji Monastery as the old and modest Damian the monk. As the fate of nearly all Bagrationi before and after, Demetrius would die rather young, a year later, at the age of 63. His body would be shipped off to Gelati Monastery, where he would be buried alongside his father and the gates he had donated. Dimitri's biggest contribution to the history of Georgia wouldn't be his peaceful politics or the gates of Ganja. Instead, it would be a song that he composed in the final years of his life as a monk. Thou Art a Vineyard is likely the most important song in Georgian history. Nearly every Georgian, or they should, know this non-instrumental choir. You are a vineyard newly blossomed, young, beautiful, growing in Eden, a fragrant poplar sapling in paradise. May God adorn you. No one is more worthy of praise. You yourself are the sun, shining brilliantly. It sounds a lot better in Georgian than it does in English. When the Soviets took hold of Georgia and banned all religious songs and scriptures, this song is the only one that remained playing in the churches and monasteries, for it does not mention God. This song, written by one of their kings nearly 1,000 years before, kept the Georgian church and spirit alive under Soviet occupation, and for that alone, Demetrius should be praised. As for the reign of Demetrius, one could critique him and compare him to his father. He was no military mastermind, but he did accomplish two things his predecessor could not: 18 years of relative peace, and the gates of Ganja. While the empire slightly unraveled under him, he still kept it together, despite 3 coup attempts, finally leaving his son to pick up the pieces he had dropped along the way. To end on King Demetrius Bagrationi, let's take a listen to his masterpiece song. I think it's nearly mystical sounding, but let me know what you think in the comments. Now, take it away, Dimitri. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark's Vacleo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Vasi, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, Dalinar, and Moist Lord. Or become a YouTube channel member, like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent. What? Why? Nick Vassian again, God, Heath Hothead 9 Dion, Carl Cleric 61 Brandian, and GOK. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I really, really appreciate ya.